Hey everyone, this is Pastor Timmy at Graham Chapel. So everyone at our church, everyone who might be watching this, and particularly the youth, we miss you. We wish we were gathering tonight for youth group like we normally do, playing games, all that stuff. But we live in this weird world where, because of the coronavirus and all the concerns that we have and not wanting to spread it, we're not able to meet tonight. But that doesn't mean we can't still be Christians. It doesn't mean we can't still dive into God's word. That doesn't mean we can't still be closer to God. And so I just encourage you during this time to take advantage of that opportunity to pray, to read the Bible, to even fellowship with people, whether online or people in your household, whatever it is, we can still grow closer to God. And so I just want to share a quick message with you now, whenever you're watching this. It's 2:37 right now, but whenever you're watching this tonight for some of you youth, I know a lot of you feel like you're stranded, you're isolated, even a little hopelessness, like, I can't go anywhere, I can't do what I want to. Some of you are even like, I hate school, but I would love to go back to school right now because I just feel so isolated and stranded in the midst of this. And some of you might feel a little hopeless, whether it's, there's this sickness and I'm scared, I'm worried, am I going to get it? Is one of my loved ones going to get it? Is someone going to die from this? You feel a little out of, like you don't have power or control over it, and so there's a lack of hope. And so, or some of you are hopeless and it's outside of my control. I can't determine when I'm going to go back to school. I can't determine when I'm going to get back to normal life. I can't determine when I'm going to go play sports again. There's kind of this hopelessness that's forming in us. So I just want to encourage you once again, in this time when we feel stranded, when we feel isolated, and we feel hopeless, to turn to God and to turn to the Bible and His Word. Because when we open it, we see time and time and time again that there are tons of godly people, tons of people we look at as examples of what it means to love God and to follow Jesus, who that's the case for them, that they're stranded, that they're hopeless, that they feel isolated. And so I just encourage you, look to those people like Daniel in the Bible, who he was taken from his homeland. He didn't want to be living in that foreign country. He didn't want to be there. He was taken there, forced to try to live in a culture he didn't necessarily want to take part of, couldn't worship God in some ways that he wanted to. They tried to force him, which he didn't, to worship their gods. And so he's in this kind of stranded situation when I'm sure at certain times he was pretty hopeless. He didn't have hope. But he clung to God in that time, and God came through for him. Look at David, King David, one of the people that we look at most as this great example of faith, this great person in the Bible. It's like we got Jesus, and then David's right there in that next group of who we look to. So much of his life, he was on the run. People were trying to kill him. His best friend's dad was trying to kill him. His son trying to kill him. He was stranded. He was isolated. He was hopeless. There were times that he was on the run, even hiding in caves, because he was so afraid and so he was so isolated from everyone else that he was hiding in caves. And so God is not, you're not the only one who's ever felt the way you're feeling right now and handling all of this, the coronavirus situation and all these things you're thinking and feeling. You're not the first one to feel that. And God has come through time and time and time again in the Bible for people who have been hopeless, who have been stranded, and who have been isolated. And so one person I just want to talk about today is Paul. Numerous times he was those things, but I want to talk about the time he got shipwrecked. And so Paul, if you're not familiar with him, we first meet Paul in the book of Acts, and he is someone who is passionate about killing Christians. Not Jesus. Often we read the Bible like, oh, this person loves God. No, he hated Jesus. He wanted to kill everyone who claimed to follow Jesus. And the first time we meet him, he's gathering up this crowd who actually kills Stephen, a Christian. They kill him because he believed in Jesus. They threw rocks at him until they killed him. Paul was kind of the ringleader of that, getting people together, and saw Christians die. Next time we kind of see him, he's on the way to the city called Damascus, and he's got a letter with him. Basically, all right, go ahead, go kill these Christians. He's got these orders to arrest and kill Christians. And so that's his identity. He's wrapped up in killing these Christians, and that's who he is. But God got a hold of his heart. God got a hold of his life. He gets miraculously saved. After Jesus already ascended into heaven, Jesus kind of appears to him in this light and asks Paul why he's persecuting him. And Paul ends up meeting Jesus, and when he meets him, he meets the truth of who Jesus is, that he is God, that he is the Savior, and all of these things, and it transforms his life. And he goes from someone who killed Christians, all that passion he had to wipe out Christianity, he now had it in following Jesus, knowing Jesus, and declaring that good news of who Jesus is to everyone else around him. And so that became his mission and goal in life, to the extent that he was a Roman citizen, although he was a Jew. And he got arrested for being a Christian. and he wanted to take his case to Caesar, he could have been free. He could have gotten away from this initial crime. But he's like, no, I'm going to appeal to Caesar, because he wanted to tell Caesar who Jesus was and about Jesus and his love. He had his mind set on that. He's going to go find the most powerful person in the world, most influential person in the world, and tell that person, Caesar, about Jesus. And so, when you're imprisoned and you're waiting for this trial, that means you're a prisoner. He's in jail a lot of the time. He's not able to go where he wants, when he wants to, much like a lot of us right now in this coronavirus time. We can't do what we want when we want to. That was Paul. He's a prisoner. At certain times he's in bondage. He's got handcuffs. He's shackled. He's got all of these things, and he can't do that stuff. So in the process of being a prisoner, in the process of being taken to Caesar, where he's a prisoner, he's still loving people along the way, like Jesus calls him to, still talking about how wonderful Jesus is, and still preaching Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and that because Jesus was raised to life, if we ask for forgiveness, we too can be raised to life. So he's sharing that with everyone he can along the way. So there's one point when he's about to get on this ship. They're taking him from one place to another on this ship. And he tells them, once again, as a prisoner, he's like, guys, like this time of year isn't a good time to sail. Like if we sail, it's going to go poorly for us. And so he kind of warns them. He's like, let's not do this. Like, I can see the clouds. I can see everything going on. Let's not set sail. They're like, you're a prisoner. And they don't really listen to him. They set sail. Lo and behold, guess what happens? They stumble into the storm. So I'm going to read from Acts chapter 27 a little bit. So starting with verse 13. So once again, this is Paul. He's a prisoner on a ship against his will, being held in isolation, in bondage, and captivity. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity to sail. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called a northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make it to the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Cyprus. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So they're pretty hopeless right here. They're isolated. They're stranded at sea. It's this terrible situation. They literally tied boats around their ship to hopefully keep it from tearing apart, because they were getting this violent battering from the storm. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men," and once again, he's a prisoner. He stood up among them, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to set sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'" So Paul is in the midst of this terrible, terrible storm. 3 days, they're totally hopeless. They think they're going to die. They've given up hope. And he just says, have courage. And the reason he's able to tell them to have courage is because the night before he met an angel showed himself to Paul. And so he had this encounter with this messenger of God. He had this direct word from God. In the midst of being isolated, in the midst of being stranded, he still met with God. And I encourage you, in this time when we're very much isolated and stranded, you can still meet with God. There's nothing stopping you from praying. There's nothing stopping you from reading the Bible. And there's nothing stopping you from engaging with God in a deeper way now than you ever have at any time in your life. And because of that relationship with God, that is why we can have courage. Even in a time of hysteria, even in a time of panic, even in a time of a pandemic, we can still have courage and faith in God for all that he can do, all that he has done, all that he is doing, and all that he's going to continue to do in your life and in all of our lives. We can have that courage. We can have that faith. And once again, it's a faith in God because he is good. But I'm going to read that last verse again before we move on to some more verses. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Think about that for a second. Paul basically tells them we're going to have to run the ship aground, destroy the ship, ruin the ship. Like if before the voyage you say we're going to have to destroy our ship, that's a monumental failure. Basically, Paul is saying to them, things are going to have to get worse before they get better. We're going to have to totally destroy this huge resource we have. We're going to have to totally destroy our ship. We're going to be hopeless, shipwrecked, and stranded because of this, but we're going to live. And so even right now, we don't know what's happening. Right now, schools are canceled for a couple weeks. We don't know what's going to happen in a couple weeks. We don't know what's going to happen in a couple months. We have no idea what the recommendations are going to be for how to go about our daily lives. But it's possible that things get worse before they get better. Night is always darkest just before the dawn. And so we don't know what's coming. But sometimes in life, when things are difficult, sometimes we have to run aground. We have to experience this hardship before we can experience the good things in life and the joy that comes with it. And so, Paul knew that tough things were going to happen, so we might have to experience some of those tough things before we can move on to what's next and move on to normalcy. So if you're like, okay, you know what, tomorrow everything is going to be better. Your ship, my ship, might have to run aground before we get to that point. All right, let's keep reading with verse 27. On the 14th night, that's 2 weeks, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took surroundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took surroundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days," he said, "you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of all of them. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, one of which was Paul, to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So things really did get worse. They're like, we're going to have to run this aground. And then 2 weeks later, still, they're being battered. They have no control. They're still stranded. They're still isolated. And they're still hopeless before finally they're able to run aground. But it wasn't this easy process. Like, Paul almost lost his life in this. I think before that point, Paul had loved and cared for people very well. Although he's a prisoner, he was there to do everything he can to love for people, care for people, and tell them about the goodness of Jesus. He earned influence in the lives of the centurions and the soldiers. And so when the sailors, so you get the sailors, people running the ship, they're like, let's get out of here. Let's get off here, leave the soldiers, leave the prisoners, leave all those people to their own, but let's save our own lives. So they're trying to get away in the lifeboats and the escape boats and stuff like that. And then Paul recognizes it, realizes it, and tells the centurions and soldiers, hey, this is what they're planning on doing. This is what they're trying. Probably should stop them. And so if he hadn't had that influence in the lives of the centurions and the soldiers, if he hadn't loved and cared for them along the way, then they'd probably been like, stop talking, prisoner. Like, no one cares what you have to say. But they listened to him. They heard him out. They recognized that what he said was true, and they acted on it and saved all of their lives. And so that's what we can do right now. While we're in this time of isolation, while we're separated from everyone else, we can still love people around us well, care for them. And when we love them well and treat them well, we're going to gain influence into their lives, and they'll hear us out. They'll listen to us. And ultimately, we can share the love of Jesus with them in the midst of that. Because once again, we look at Jesus. Jesus calls us to love our brothers and sisters. Jesus calls us to love our families. He calls us to love our friends. And he also calls us to love our enemies. So whoever you're stuck with in this time of isolation and being stranded, Jesus calls you to love them and to love them well. And when you do that, even in a self-sacrificing way like Paul did, you're going to gain this influence to speak truth into their lives. And that's when we can speak about the goodness and love of Jesus. So I encourage you to do that. Love people well, and then when you have that influence, speak to them about Jesus. And in Paul's case, it saved his life. So because he saw this and did all this, and saw the plan of the sailors, he gained the trust of the centurion. And so when they've shipwrecked, when they've run aground, when they've run ashore, the soldiers are like, we got to kill all the prisoners. We can't risk them getting away. And so like, let's just kill them. And the centurion's like, no, we can't do that, because he cared and respected Paul. And so by Paul's actions earlier, he saved his own life, but he also saved the lives of many other prisoners because of his faithfulness to do what's right and to love people and serve people well. And so in this time, we can take note of that. And I'm not just talking physically. Yeah, we need to be careful to wash our hands thoroughly, elbow bump, stay 6 feet away, all those things that are being recommended to help save other people's lives and not spread this disease. But spiritually, more importantly, if we're there to love people well, and give our lives to Jesus, by giving our lives to Jesus and loving people well, that's going to end up saving other people's lives, because they'll see Jesus, they'll see his love, they'll hear about him, and they'll see how you live differently in this time of hysteria and chaos and pandemic. And they'll be like, you know what? Let me look more into this person of Jesus and hear that person out and hear you out. So that's my encouragement for you. Things might get worse. We don't know what's going to happen. Paul was stranded at sea for 14 days at least. And then he's shipwrecked after that. We're kind of stranded for at least 14 days, really closer to 21 days here in the South Carolina area with schools being closed and spring break. We're kind of stranded right now. But how are we going to live while we're stranded? How are we going to live while we're isolated? Are we going to meet with God, or are we going to do our own thing? Are we going to love people well, or are we going to be selfish? And that can make a difference in your life, and it can make a difference in countless people's lives if we choose to meet with God like Paul did, and if we choose to love people well like Paul did. So we'll pick up with this story probably next week. I'll post another video about this, what happens once they get ashore and what happens there. How does that story continue? What does God do? How does he use Paul? But that's what we got. So that's the challenge for you. Hope you're doing well. If you have any thoughts or prayer requests, reach out to us. If you need groceries, if you need any way that we can help you, just let us know. We love you. We care about you. And we'll talk to you next week.